In a courtroom where justice was a joke, I, a defense attorney, was slapped. That's when I decided to take the judge's seat myself. The air in courtroom 3B always tasted stale, like old paper and quiet desperation. I'd spent more hours in this room than I had in my own apartment some weeks, and I knew its rhythms. The squeak of the prosecutor's cheap shoes, the weary sigh of the public defender, the bored cough from the gallery. But today the rhythm was off. The air was thick and charged, humming with a low-grade hostility that was aimed squarely at my table. My client, Jamal, a kid barely 20 with eyes that were far too old, sat beside me, his hands cuffed in his lap, his leg bouncing a nervous staccato against the floor. Across the room, Officers Miller and Davis were lounging on the witness bench as if it were a sofa in their living room. Miller, a burly man whose uniform seemed a size too small for his simmering rage, was the one on the stand. Davis, younger and weaselly, was there for backup. They kept exchanging smirks, little inside jokes at our expense. I'd seen their type 1,000 times. They'd pulled Jamal over for a broken taillight that miraculously fixed itself once the car was impounded. They'd claimed he was aggressive when he asked why he was being stopped. The resisting arrest charge was the cherry on top of their predictable, rotten Sunday. "So, Officer Miller," I said, my voice calm and even, a carefully constructed dam against the fury I felt. "Your report, filed at 8:17 p.m., states that my client, and I quote, lunged violently at your partner. Is that correct?" Miller shifted his weight, the leather of his duty belt groaning in protest. "That's what I wrote. That's what happened." "Interesting," I mused, tapping my pen on the file. "Because Officer Davis's body camera footage, which we only received this morning after 3 separate motions, shows my client with his hands on the hood of his car. It shows you shoving him against the vehicle. There is no lunge, officer, not a single one. The prosecutor, a fresh-faced kid named Peterson, shot up. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is mischaracterizing the evidence. The problem was, there was no honor to object to. Judge Albright was running late, as usual. A timid-looking clerk had informed us he was concluding a conference call 10 minutes ago, leaving the courtroom in this simmering limbo. In his absence, Officer Miller felt emboldened. He leaned forward into the microphone, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. "You can twist the video all you want, Counselor. We were there. We know what these guys are like." He was being a punk. "Objection," I snapped, turning to the empty judge's chair out of pure reflex. "The witness is making prejudicial and unfounded statements about my client." Miller chuckled, a low, nasty sound. "Look at her," he said, not to me, but to his partner and the room at large. All fired up. "You get a little law degree and you think you can talk to us however you want." My blood ran cold. I'd been talked down to, patronized, and underestimated my entire career. It was part of the uniform I wore as a black woman in this system. But this was different. This was raw, undisguised contempt in a room that was supposed to represent justice. I turned to face him fully, my voice dropping an octave. "Officer, my name is Imani Clark. You will address me as Ms. Clark or as Counselor. My little law degree gives me the right to question you under oath about the inconsistencies in your sworn testimony, a right I intend to exercise fully. Now, for the 3rd time, why does your report contradict the video evidence?" The smirk vanished from his face. The vein on his temple, which had been a faint blue line, was now a pulsing cord. He stood up from the witness chair, a clear violation of protocol. The bailiff, an older man who was probably counting the days to retirement, didn't even flinch. "You need to learn some respect," Miller growled, taking a step toward my table. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I stood my ground. I would not be intimidated. "And you need to learn to tell the truth under oath." It happened so fast, yet it felt like it unfolded in slow motion, the space between us closing, the prosecutor's mouth opening to object again, Jamal's sharp intake of breath, Miller's arm swinging back, and then the crack. The sound echoed in the stunned silence of the courtroom. It wasn't a punch. It was a slap. Open-palmed, deliberate, and demeaning. My head snapped to the side, my cheek erupting in a blaze of fire and humiliation. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. For a split second, the only sound was the buzzing of the fluorescent lights above. I slowly turned my head back to face him. My vision was blurry with unshed tears of pure rage. He was standing there, his chest puffed out, a look of smug satisfaction on his face, as if he'd just put a dog back in its kennel. Davis was smiling. The bailiff was just watching. At that exact moment, the heavy door behind the bench swung open. Judge Albright, a portly man with a perpetually annoyed expression, bustled in, his black robes flowing behind him. He took one look at the seen me standing with a bright red handprint blooming on my cheek, Miller standing over me like a predator, the entire room frozen in shock, and he sighed. "What is all this commotion?" he grumbled, settling into his high-backed chair. "Can we please get this circus underway?" Peterson, the prosecutor, finally found his voice. "Your Honor, there's been an incident." I looked at the judge, the so-called arbiter of justice. I looked at the officer who had just assaulted me. I looked at my client whose hope was draining from his eyes. And in that moment something inside me broke. Or maybe it was finally forged. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. And I was done playing by its rules. I didn't say a word. I simply smoothed down the front of my blazer, my movements calm and deliberate. The fire on my cheek cooled into an icy resolve that spread through my veins. Judge Albright banged his gavel impatiently. "Well, Miss Clark, do you have any more questions for this officer?" I looked past the officer, past the prosecutor, and directly at the man on the bench. My feet weren't moving toward my client. They weren't moving toward the exit. They were carrying me, with a purpose I had never known before, straight toward the judge's empty dais. My heels clicked on the worn linoleum, a sharp, deliberate sound that cut through the stunned silence. Each step was a drumbeat, counting down the last seconds of the woman I used to be. The prosecutor, Peterson, took a step towards me, his hand outstretched as if to physically stop me. "Miss Clark, what are you doing?" he stammered, his voice a bewildered squeak. I didn't even grant him a glance. My focus was singular, a laser beam aimed at the elevated platform that symbolized everything wrong with this room. Judge Albright's face cycled through a series of emotions: confusion, annoyance, and finally, sputtering outrage. "Counselor," he bellowed, his jowls quivering, "return to your table immediately. This is a courtroom, not a theater." But I had already reached the low wooden gate. I pushed it open. The latch clicked shut behind me, a sound of finality. 2 steps up, then 3. I was on the dais now, standing beside the clerk who was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I was on the same level as the judge. From up here, the perspective was entirely different. I could see the whole board. I could see Officer Miller, his smugness finally cracking, replaced by a baffled uncertainty. I could see Jamal, my client, looking at me with a mixture of terror and something I hadn't seen in his eyes before, a flicker of awe. "Miss Clark, I am warning you," Albright roared, rising halfway out of his chair. "You are in contempt of court. Bailiff, do your job. Remove her." The elderly bailiff, whose name was Frank, finally jolted into action. He started moving toward the dais, his hand resting uncertainly on his sidearm. But he was too slow. My path wasn't to the side of the bench. It was behind it. I rounded the massive oak desk and stood directly behind the high-backed leather chair. Judge Albright was still standing, leaning over his desk, his face purple with rage. I simply looked at him. I didn't say a word. I just held his gaze until he, for reasons he probably couldn't comprehend himself, took a hesitant step back. That was all the space I needed. I sat down. The leather sighed under my weight as if it recognized a long overdue occupant. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Shouts from the gallery, Peterson yelling objections to no one in particular, Miller shouting something about crazy. In the middle of it all, Judge Albright stood beside his own bench, rendered a spectator in his own domain. He looked utterly bewildered, like a king who'd suddenly found a commoner sitting on his throne. My hand found the gavel. The wood felt heavy, solid, an instrument of order. I lifted it high, the movement feeling both alien and perfectly natural. I brought it down once. Bang! The sound was like a gunshot. It cracked through the pandemonium, shocking everyone into silence. Even the buzzing fluorescent lights seemed to hold their breath. In the sudden quiet, my voice, amplified by the acoustics of the room, was perfectly clear. "This court," I announced, my words ringing with an authority I didn't know I possessed, "is now under new management." I swiveled the big chair to face Officer Miller, who was still standing in the witness box, his jaw hanging open. "Officer Miller," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "a few moments ago, you committed battery against an officer of the court. You did so in plain sight of multiple witnesses, in a sworn proceeding. You have demonstrated a violent contempt not for me, but for the very institution you are sworn to serve. Therefore, I find you in criminal contempt." I turned my attention to the bailiff, who had frozen at the foot of the dais. "Bailiff," I commanded, my tone leaving no room for negotiation, "take that man into custody." Every head in the room swiveled to poor Frank. He stood paralyzed, a deer caught between two sets of headlights. On one side was Judge Albright, the legitimate state-sanctioned authority, now flapping his arms and screeching like a seagull. "Don't you dare, Frank, you listen to me. Arrest her. Arrest that woman." On the other side was me, the woman he had just seen get assaulted with impunity, the woman who now sat in the seat of power, speaking with the unwavering certainty of the righteous. Frank looked at the judge, the symbol of the law. Then he looked at me, the person who had just been failed by it. His gaze flickered to Officer Miller, whose face was now a mask of pure fury. The bailiff's hand, which had been resting on his gun, slowly moved. It hovered, for a heart-stopping second, over the cold steel of his handcuffs. The click of the handcuffs was deafening in the suddenly silent courtroom. Frank didn't move toward me. He didn't move toward Judge Albright. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had made a decision he would live with for the rest of his life, straight to the witness box. Officer Miller watched him come, a sneer of disbelief on his face. "Frank, what the hell do you think you're doing?" he spat. "My job," Frank said, his voice gravelly but firm. He grabbed Miller's wrist. "You're under arrest." For a second, Miller was too stunned to react. Then, raw fury erupted. He ripped his arm away. "Get your hands off me! You old fossil, I'll have your badge for this!" He shoved Frank, who stumbled back. His partner, Davis, lunged forward to help, reaching for his own handcuffs. The room was a powder keg, and the fuse had just been lit. Bang! I slammed the gavel down again, harder this time. The sound reverberated off the wood-paneled walls. "Officer Davis, you will stand down, or you will join your partner in a holding cell." I pointed the gavel at him. "Bailiff, secure the prisoner." My voice held a command I had only ever dreamed of. It was the voice of the bench itself. Maybe it was my tone. Maybe it was the sheer, unprecedented insanity of the situation. But something broke the spell. Two other deputies, drawn by the commotion, burst through the gallery doors. They stopped dead, taking in the scene. A furious cop fighting an elderly bailiff, a sputtering judge off to the side, and me, a black woman in a business suit, sitting on the judge's throne, holding the gavel like a scepter. They looked at Frank, who was an institution in this courthouse. They looked at Miller, whose reputation for being a hothead was well known. They made their choice. They converged on Miller, professionally and efficiently subduing him as he screamed obscenities. With order momentarily restored, I turned the chair to face my client. Jamal was staring at me, his eyes wide, his cuffed hands clasped together, as if in prayer. I gave him a small, reassuring nod. "Mr. Jamal Williams," I said, my voice now formal, official. "The evidence against you, namely the arresting officer's testimony, has been proven to be unreliable and perjurious. The video evidence clearly contradicts the official report. Furthermore, the lead officer has committed a violent felony in this very courtroom, demonstrating a character utterly unfit to serve as a witness for the state." I took a breath, the stale air now tasting of victory. "Therefore, on the grounds of egregious police misconduct and a complete failure of the prosecution to present credible evidence, I am dismissing all charges against you, with prejudice." I looked at Peterson, the prosecutor, whose face was the color of ash. "That means you cannot refile. This is over. Bailiff, please uncuff Mr. Williams. He is a free man." As Frank unlocked Jamal's cuffs, the main doors to the courtroom swung open. This time it wasn't just deputies. It was the county sheriff himself, flanked by the presiding judge of the district. The real power had arrived. The sheriff, a tall, imposing man I'd argued against many times, didn't look at Miller or the chaos. His eyes landed on me. I knew my time was up. I had broken 12 laws and 1,000 rules of decorum. But as I looked at Jamal rubbing his freed wrists, a smile spreading across his face for the first time since I'd met him, I felt no regret. Slowly I stood up from the judge's chair. I placed the gavel down gently on the blotter. I didn't wait for them to come to me. I walked down from the dais, my head held high, and held out my wrists for the sheriff. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. The story became a national headline. "The imposter judge. Courtroom coup." My picture was everywhere. The video from the security cameras which captured the slap, and my subsequent ascension to the bench, went viral. Officer Miller and his partner Davis were fired and faced charges for assault and perjury. Judge Albright was forced into an early retirement. After a judicial review, committee saw footage of his utter failure to control his own courtroom. And me, I was disbarred, of course. I faced my own charges of contempt of court, impersonating a public official, and 6 other things they threw at me. My legal career was over. But as I walked out of the courthouse on bail, blinking in the sudden sunlight, I saw Jamal standing on the steps with his mother, who was weeping and hugging him. He caught my eye and gave me a nod, a look of profound life-altering gratitude. The sting on my cheek from Miller's hand was long gone, but I knew in that moment that the mark he'd left was permanent. It wasn't a mark of shame. It was the brand that had forged me into something more than a lawyer. They had taken my career, and my future was uncertain. But as I stood there, a free woman watching a free man, I knew I had found something far more valuable. I had found justice, and for the first time in a very long time, I had made the law serve it.